and to deal with stress. I'm going to show you a few slides on the sides. I hope we'll see them together. That allows us to kind of think together about what's known. So the first slide is a picture of Madame Curie, who had famously said, "Nothing is to be feared, it is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more so that we may fear less." I think nothing could be more timely. The understanding of how humans deal with stress and how we deal with social behavior has to be seen in the context of evolution. How did this all come to be? Why are relationships like love, social bonds so important? How do they allow us to survive and experience a sense of safety in a dangerous world? What are we doing? We're protecting and healing. Our body is protecting and healing itself in the face of threats, danger, and illness. And part of that mechanism is most effectively triggered by social behavior or a sense of social behavior, since we're living in a peculiar time where people actually are encouraged to isolate themselves. We really want to think deeply about what's going on inside of our bodies and use that knowledge to help us to more effectively use the social nervous system to protect us. So it's an interesting challenge, one that we'll cover in the next few minutes very, very briefly, but I encourage you to think about and read about on your own because it's so important to the survival and to the evolution of human beings. The world has always held danger and trauma. The famous wave off of Kanagawa is a picture of a tsunami. We have always had things going on Mother Earth that we couldn't control. And the body that we hold now, the one that keeps us upright on the planet, allows us to survive and to reproduce, contains mechanisms to save ourselves from this fear. Not necessarily the actual events, but from the fear of them. And I think that's what's really hurting us right now. Survival, of course, is called the first law of nature. It's biologically important that we're not alone. Sociality has survival benefits. There's always safety in numbers. Even bacteria do better if they're in groups. So survival and reproduction have purposes, one of which is keeping us alive. The other is allowing us to reproduce. However, most of our sort of scientific history has focused on one person or what we call a unit of analysis, the individual, when in fact, most living organisms cannot survive or reproduce alone. As I've mentioned, even bacteria do better when they're in groups. And the mammalian nervous system is probably the kind of penultimate version of need for others. Social behavior and connection are necessary for physiological and behavioral homeostasis. Psychotherapist Myron Hofer coined a concept of hidden regulators. So inside of us, inside our brains, inside our whole body are regulators that are helping hold us together. How do we know that? Well, even if we hadn't ever done any scientific studies, we would know it because what happens in the absence of other, if there's a long period of isolation, and remember this isolation is how we see it, perceived isolation, then we find that people tend to abuse food, drugs, they may even experience mental illness or mental dysfunctions. And in the total absence of what I'll call love here, we start to see depression, illness, shutdowns, even death. Loving relationships can come in many forms. There's no one solution. But the social stimuli that come from those relationships can come, as I've said, from partners, from family, from pets. I've been asked many times to talk about love. The reason is not because I set out to study it. I really didn't. I set out to understand how it was that people became attached to each other. But I wanted to use a biological model, and this brought me to doing animal research. That research, eventually I realized, was what we call love. So the pictures I'm showing you here today, many of them are my family. This is my younger son, Seth, and his beautiful fiancée, Elsa, and he had just proposed to her. They were in the Caribbean, and he had very cleverly hidden a photographer in the rocks, so he got a complete record of what happened. My older son, Eric, is showing you that what I'll call the prototype of love, which is the parent-baby interaction. And Minna, who's in these pictures, who's now almost 2.5, is an extremely good subject. So even on the day she was born, she had gone through a very difficult labor, eventually a C-section. Nonetheless, she bounced back, showing us how incredibly resilient humans are and constantly exudes love. So when I use the word love, though, because of my scientific background, I'm actually using it as a neurobiological concept, a bunch of processes that together facilitate not only social behavior, but also wellness, health, reproductive fitness, biological optimality. Now, oxytocin itself, we now know, affects basically everything. This was a bit of a shock because the initial research suggested it was a female hormone, mostly involved in birth and lactation. That's far from the case. Oxytocin is at the center of resilience and survival. Of course, it does play a role in reproduction, a role in what we're calling love. It plays a role in maternity and paternity. Fathers involved with babies get extra oxytocin. And ultimately, the big question is survival of the genome. And oxytocin's right at the center of that story. Oxytocin's a simple little molecule with so many functions. The most important for us right now is its role in stress and trauma. It's a funny molecule in a way. It's very tiny. It has only 9 amino acids, and it has a ring in it indicated in that slide that I had up by a bar between 2 of those amino acids. That ring is held together by sulfur bonds. And those of you who are not chemists say, oh my, who cares? Well, the answer is that sulfur, which you probably recognize as the smell of rotten eggs or a volcano, that odor is so powerful because it bonds to just about everything. The odor bonds and the bonds within the hormone bind to lots of things. So you have an unusually biologically active molecule that's capable of supporting social behavior, stress buffering, and virtually every aspect of good health. I'm going to go a little bit quickly here, so I want to tell you that oxytocin does not work alone. The other molecule that's most associated with oxytocin is a hormone called vasopressin. Vasopressin and oxytocin evolved from a single ancestral molecule, gene. It was called vasotocin. It took about 600 million years ago, vasopressin appeared About 250 million, now I'm saying million years ago, vasopressin came on the scene, and about 150 million years ago, or a little less, oxytocin appeared. It's in that transition to oxytocin, that mammals also appeared on the planet. There is something very, very fundamental about oxytocin. As I've said, it not only is helping us survive today and everything that's going on in the face of complex modern infections and social turmoil, we have an amazingly old and amazingly powerful mechanism for dealing with that. I mentioned it was first thought to be a female reproductive hormone. That sort of stopped the story in its tracks for a while because it was not realized that it affected males and females. Now we know this. We know it's made in the brain, and it acts not only by entering the bloodstream at a place called the posterior pituitary, but it also goes up into the brain itself, all through the brain. The human nervous system is a very, very interesting, shall we say, structure. It differs from our reptilian ancestors primarily because of our huge cortex. And that cortex depends on oxytocin. It depends on it in many ways. Birth, which is a very difficult process for humans, and I'll show you why in a second. And lactation, which allows us to support newborn babies. Oxytocin helps through the vagus nerve, which if you watch Dr. Stephen Porges' presentation, you'll learn about the myelinated vagus, the modern vagus. That is part of the mechanism that gets oxygen to the brain. Oxytocin regulates the vagus. I'll say that several times. With a cortex, with a big brain, we can think, we can build structures, we can plan ahead, and we are here today because of that cortex and because oxytocin supports it. Our big problem came when we started walking upright. The pelvis became fixed, differs from the gorilla shown in this picture I have on the screen. The gorilla pelvis is very, very good for moving quickly, but the gorilla can use 4 legs. We have only 2. However, we're quite speedy by pushing off of the pelvis. At the same time, we've got to get our babies out through that space in the pelvic girdle. Oxytocin helps with that process. So now the question we're interested in today, the one that the whole world is interested in, is how can we manage stress and trauma? How does the power of love, how does social behavior overcome fear? We know this much. We know that love and this social capacity that I'm talking about originated from the same processes that underlie motherhood. The mechanisms that I've mentioned that allow us to give birth, to nurse our babies, and now we know form secure attachments. And those secure attachments are that mental representation that allows us to be alone and not to feel alone. All of that is strong medicine. So that dangerous world that we live in is only dangerous if we see it as dangerous. Being afraid can be adaptive. Social bonds and love can overcome fear, but we have to understand how. Trauma, such as that shown here in pictures of Japanese women after the tsunami, is one of the processes. It's an adaptive process. Steve talks about it a lot in his work, Steve Porges, because it allows the body to conserve energy. but it also makes us at risk for depression and a number of forms of very frightening experiences. These are ancient processes, and the ability of love or connection or social behavior to overcome them was known for a long time. Here from the Bible, we have a famous quote, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casteth out fear." That's biology. The fear is adaptive. The biology of love is the ability to overcome that system. Chronic fear can become maladaptive. Vigilance, territoriality, oversympathetic arousal, anxiety, mobilization, all of these emerge, at least in some people, but they are only adaptive in the short term, not in the long term. So we have this amazing process that can overcome it, and it's based on a series of hormones and physiological states regulated not only by oxytocin and the associated vasopressin, but also the autonomic nervous system. The chemical processes are older than the neural process. We had a chemistry of love before we had the vagus nerve, but the vagus allows us to integrate all of this together. So this evolution of sociality and love is a kind of dance between hormones, between neural pathways, and it allows us to be able to defend ourselves and mobilize, but also to relax and restore. That's what we're looking for now. We're looking for an understanding of how love, connection, and our biology can act as medicine in the face of fear. The ancient capacity to give birth and to breastfeed is the basic mechanism through which this biology evolved. The family became part of it. Fathers, mothers, other individuals within the family, all of these are context for safety. It's not just about genetics, it's about who cares for you and who's willing to help you. Babies, of course, are not delivered by big birds, they must be born. And one of the most stressful experiences for humans is birth. Oxytocin allows birth to occur. It not only gets the baby from inside the mom to the outside, but it also prepares the mother so she can attach to and become involved with that baby and nurse it. So these protective effects of early life experience, attachment, as well as nursing, are dependent on the oxytocin system. The way this works is a bit complex, and I won't probably go through it in detail today, except to tell you that by having two hormones involved, both oxytocin and vasopressin, we have two ways of dealing with a difficulty. One is this sort of love safety pathway. The other, which is older, perhaps more efficient, but also, if it goes on too long, can become deadly, is the mechanism for anxiety or fear. Vasopressin and oxytocin sort of play off of each other, vasopressin being particularly important to fear, oxytocin to prosociality. Vasopressin regulates something known as the sympathetic nervous system, the flight-fight mechanisms. The oxytocin is primarily involved with parasympathetic and vagal activities. Both are protected, both are important. You can't get rid of one or the other. But if the protective, active, primitive strategies are dominant, that's very energetically expensive. It's dangerous over time. It's good in the short term, as I've said, bad in the long term. The oxytocin mechanism is dominant. when there's a sense of safety. So our message here today is that the more we can allow ourselves to be in a psychological space of safety, the safer we really are. So it's a kind of circle, right? Now, oxytocin has proven rather difficult to study because it can actually act like vasopressin, and I won't go through the physiology of this, but under contexts of anxiety or fear, oxytocin may actually, if you give extra oxytocin, it can act like vasopressin. So the use of oxytocin as a medicine is still very difficult to deal with because it's not simply going to a receptor for oxytocin itself, but it can move over into that older fear and anxiety system. Oxytocin, though, is incredibly powerful. As I've told you, it's 150 million years old, the actual molecule. That's a long time to develop a lot of important functions. But oxytocin is not just released under positive conditions. It's released when the body needs it. It's a stress coping molecule. And what does it do? It is anti-inflammatory. It can stop these processes that sometimes run away, as in situations like influenza, where the body overreacts, creates too much inflammation, tissues swell, and the body doesn't work as well. There are a lot of diseases that oxytocin seems to be able to benefit, primarily, probably because it allows us to cope differently, both in a psychological sense of coping and in a physical sense. This picture, perhaps it's hard for people to see, is one that I'll explain in a second. The autonomic nervous system, primarily the vagus nerve, innervates just about everything in the body, probably everything. It comes out of the spinal cord. It's called the 10th cranial nerve. It's the largest nerve in the body. And it links the body not only by putting out information, but receiving information from the entire body. So if you have a stomach ache, that's the vagus giving you information in part. Because oxytocin, as well as vasopressin, can regulate the autonomic nervous system, both of them are central to allowing us to understand why overreaction is so dangerous. There are many, many studies, hundreds, perhaps now thousands, showing that oxytocin can play a role in mental and physical health. I've listed on the slide that I've got on my screen some of the disorders, just a few, especially mental disorders like autism spectrum, schizophrenia, anxiety, depression, trauma. All of these have been shown to have an oxytocin link. On the physical side, all aspects of stress management. Cardiovascular system is directly regulated by oxytocin. The heart is full of oxytocin receptors, but the vagus nerve, which goes to the heart and regulates it all the time, is also regulated by oxytocin. Obesity seems to have an oxytocin link. There are a number of studies going on looking at obesity as a disorder of the oxytocin system. Things that you might not expect, like bone health, muscle strength, chronic pain, fibromyalgia, all of these have been shown to be improved by finding mechanisms to upregulate oxytocin. Remember, I'm warning you, it's not a great drug, because if you overdose on it, it will actually backfire, act like vasopressin, and you may get exactly the opposite. But oxytocin, because I think of its powerful anti-inflammatory process, can save us, if you will, in the face of stress that we might not otherwise be able to manage. Vasopressin, in contrast, is predominantly pro-inflammatory. So inflammation is not always bad. If you have a wound, you want to immediately, your body needs to immediately respond to that. But if it stays in an inflamed state over time, this becomes a disorder. There's a really interesting line of research going on in the world on the microbiome, and it turns out that oxytocin acts on the gut, and it probably acts directly on the microbiome. But if you're taking probiotics or eating yogurt, doing things to help your microbiome, you are actually signaling through oxytocin to the brain that this is a good time, this is a healthy time. There's so much known now about early life experience, and we won't have time to talk about it, but this extremely complex slide I am showing you for one reason only. Early life stress is, in a sense, imprinted on the nervous system by both the oxytocin and vasopressin mechanisms. These in turn affect everything, what's called here allostatic or sometimes called homeostatic processes. We each differ genetically. We have vulnerabilities that make us strong in some settings and perhaps weak in others. But we also have the capacity, and there's a very important lesson here. What we do to babies is so important to their later capacity to manage stress. We have to acknowledge and start to raise our babies taking this into account. Positive social experiences starting from the first moment of life, starting from motherhood, prime this sort of love system. They allow us to form attachments. Those secure attachments then tell us, even when the world seems to be going into sort of a chaotic state, don't panic. You were okay. You are okay. We can replenish this system in adulthood, but it takes more work. We have to be very patient. We have to understand the needs of others. So the power of love originates in the biology of birth, lactation, social behaviors. It allows us to support others throughout life. But the others support us too. Dostoevsky says the soul is healed by being with children. Children and the love we have for them comes back to us. So I'm going to finish this part of the talk by reminding you of Marie Curie's statement again. Nothing is to be feared, it is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more so that we may fear less. Thank you very much. Jessica.
Okay, so Sue, thank you very much for that presentation. Really, I'm going to throw it open now to the floor and see if people have questions for Sue. There's a question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to fire any questions in there. And Sue, thank you very much for presenting today.
Thank you. It's an honor. Jessica, if there are no questions, let me add a little bit of background, because many of the people coming to this group are interested in yoga, mindfulness.
Yeah, please do.
The evidence that oxytocin plays a role in this is pretty slight, not because it's not there, but because it's hard to study. But the few studies that have been done, or at least published, are all confirmatory. There was a study done in India a few years ago showing that oxytocin, over a period of a week of yoga training, oxytocin levels went up. They actually went up fourfold, 400%. Very big change. I've worked on a study on loving kindness meditation with a collaborator, Jim Harris, from the Johns Hopkins University. We found a bit more complex kind of relationship. We found that about a third of the people were actually showing increases. This was a 1 week long silent retreat, guided retreat, very intense. And the people who come to those kind of retreats have often a lot of anxiety they're trying to deal with. About a third of the people, well, no, I'm sorry, more than about 2/3 of the people, we haven't published this study yet, showed increases over time in oxytocin. The people who were experienced meditators did the best. Someone else working at the same center had done a parallel study of mindfulness. It was a different study, it was longer, and it was also very intense. And in that study, actually, oxytocin went down. But the question that we don't know the answer to is whether or not that change is due to the fact that they were simply in a kind of intense, as I've said, and attempting to be mindfulness for, in this case, 2.5 weeks, may have been more than their body was ready for. I think oxytocin has a lot to teach us, though, about somatic therapy. It is released by exercise, so if you want to know the very best way, quickest way to release oxytocin, it's probably exercise, all different kinds. Yoga, however, gives you a very different kind of exercise than, for example, running a marathon. And almost certainly the effects of those are different as well on how the body manages stress. So.
Right, Sue, so you've got some questions coming in there. Can you see the Q&A?
Let me see.
I think you might have to get rid of, unshare your screen to start with.
Yes, except that.
Well, I'll tell you what, if you click
it. Share.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay. And
so if you go down to Q&A, you've got quite a collection of questions coming in there.
Okay, wonderful. So the first one says, how are we able to naturally create oxytocin? I believe is the way to. I wonder about oxytocin and how one is able to naturally create this. Well, the answer is quite simple. You have to feel either safe or use the fact that your body releases that hormone to cope with stress. And those are two very different experiences. It's an amazing molecule because it's going to help you no matter what you do. Someone else has asked, do we have tips for supporting others to build resilience during this time? Well, anything you can do to make yourself feel safe psychologically, emotionally, and physically is going to help. So right now, at least in the United States, we're being encouraged to social distance. Well, unfortunately, this is kind of the opposite of what humans are wired to do. We're wired to be together, as I explained. But We have the capacity, the wonderful thing about having a cortex, having a brain, is that we have the capacity to, in a cognitive way, have experiences. We can also use technology, and what hasn't been done to my knowledge yet, but I'm sure will be, is to begin to look at the benefits, which I'm sure there are many, of simply engaging with others online, dealing with other people. Again, it's a little complicated, just as, for example, social media is complex. People can have adverse experiences. They can feel fear, they can feel shame, all of the emotions that sort of shift us into a primitive state, into a state of fear. But sometimes just knowing it's happening can be helpful. So part of this answer is do whatever you can to draw on your social resources. Use your body. Don't be afraid of your body. Even if you're not an athlete, there are many kinds of experiences, breathing being perhaps the most potent, that activate this system. So we are very fortunate. As I said, we wouldn't be here if we weren't capable of dealing with anxiety and fear. But again, I wish I could give you a simple recipe. That's the work of the people doing the body work, I think, is to come up with highly efficient ways to allow the body to feel better, to allow the body, as I've said, and you all know, most of you do have some kind of body practices. One of the other questions I have was, someone says they do yoga daily in nature. Very good idea. Breathing exercises, and eating well. All of these are feeding back through the vagus nerve, through the body's wiring systems to help us feel better. So again, there's no simple answer, but knowing that the body can help you sometimes just by itself is enough to probably shift into a safer state of mind. Does that help? I've got more questions. If not. Okay, someone writing to me also is a midwife and wanted to know about the relationship between oxytocin and adrenaline. Adrenaline is a molecule from the adrenal gland that's part of the signaling to run away, to stop the labor and save yourself, so to speak. So a woman in labor, if the famous saber-toothed tiger comes, she has to stop having that baby and get out of there. It's a very complicated thing because birth is hard to stop once it gets going. But vasopressin's role in births, which one of your questions from the audience was, vasopressin is probably part of this older mechanism for creating a birth-like experience of causing the uterus to contract, but it contracts the uterus, as far as we know, in a kind of tonic way. So it might either stop labor, or if the labor is going along, it might speed it up. In both cases, not necessarily the best thing to happen. So humans evolved to give birth by themselves or with the help of others, but we were not, shall we say, perfectly designed for the huge babies we have right now. So those in the audience who are midwives will appreciate that it's gotten harder and harder for humans to give birth. And I think in the United Kingdom, the current C-section rate's about 27%. United States, it's closer to 1 in 3. We have a lot of babies that are being birthed under conditions of fear. Vasopressin, the message from vasopressin and adrenaline and other molecules is stop that labor right now. Let's wait. We'll get back to this later. That isn't always convenient. I have another question, perhaps the one that we're going to have most often really is, how does oxytocin, how can we upregulate that system? So in the few minutes we have left, I will kind of summarize what we've said or what we know, which is not enough. Trust me, we need to know more. The first answer is to, in sort of daily life, do the things that make you feel safe. Yoga works for a lot of people. Breathing or breath and yoga. Dealing with your social life, not eliciting social anger or other feelings, not going into those states. Those, I have to point out that sometimes anxiety and fear actually sort of feel good. They have an arousing and intrinsically rewarding property. And so people will begin a cascade in which they literally find themselves looking for reasons to be upset or misidentifying their internal feelings and labeling something in the outside world. And this right now is a very dangerous thing to do because we're often restricted in our social environment to ourselves, if we're lucky, perhaps a pet, or one or a few partners. Those relationships may not have been designed to endure months or weeks or months of only having those as your companions. So we have a time when we have to reflect deeply, go inside, use our resources, use our bodies, use our capacity to breathe, to have relaxed breath, not angry breath, to have, as I've said, physical exercise is really critical. And we've only just recognized this in the last few years, that exercise has virtually healing powers for virtually every disorder. There was one study done a couple of years ago in animals in which they actually exposed the animals to a breast cancer model where they put in little breast cancer cells. And those animals that could exercise overcame the breast cancer. Those that just stayed still, didn't have the access to an exercise opportunity, did not do as well. So even something like cancer can be affected by exercise. It's entirely possible that oxytocin is part of that mechanism. Oxytocin's nice because you don't have to worry about it. It's not to worry about. It's not to be either feared or revered. It's to allow us to realize that, in a sense, our ancestors left us with something beautiful going on inside. And our job is to set up our environment and our psychological state so that we recognize and appreciate how important that is and how much value it has to us, to honor social behavior, to use whatever tools we have right now, maybe it's the internet, to re-engage relationships that make you feel safe. It's probably not necessarily a great time to negotiate those that are living in fear, and we see that it can be dangerous. We don't know, probably won't know until this is over exactly how many people have had adverse experiences, but a lot of people are having wonderful experiences, even now, even a month or so. As I talk to people, they're starting to feel calmer, their lives a bit more in control. Now they're in control only if they've got food and resources and aren't living in fear. So I hope that helps. Let's see if we have any other questions. If not, Jessica, do you have any others?
No, I don't. I was just thinking what a really, really useful presentation this has been. So much to learn. And for myself as a yoga therapist, it's really helpful to contextualize some of the work I do with clients and things like that. So, thank you very, very much for your time today.
It was my pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Goodbye.
Thank you, people, for tuning in this afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.